All right, good morning, everyone. Good to see all of you here today. For those of you I haven't had the opportunity to meet yet, my name is Michael. I'm one of the pastors here at Cedarbrook, and I want to share a little family photo with you all. It's this photo right here. I know, maybe look a little bit different than your family photos, but this is our family, myself, my wife Amanda, our son Levi, and then our youngest son Matthias in a courtroom because this was the day that we officially became the parents of Matthias. Now, a couple years earlier, we did this with Levi as he was adopted, and then we got to do this in 2014 with Matthias, and this is what they call Gotcha Day. We became his parents, and this is our family. This is the beginning of our family that we will, from this day forward, continue to grow together. And we have some values that we share in our home as we learn to grow together, like, spending some time together and having a meal together, and the way that we communicate with one another respectfully and not fighting all the time and things like that. But one thing in particular came up, actually came from my son Matthias just a few months ago. And somehow as parents, we became focused on things that were left undone, things that were not right. So things like, it's your chore to clean the bathroom. Great, I'm glad that you wiped the counter down, but you need to clean the toilet too. And we would focus on the things that were left undone. You're supposed to take the trash out. Well, but you forgot this thing. And so we would get focused on the thing that was left undone or was wrong. And he brought it to our attention, like, I do good stuff too. There's things that I have done well, but you don't talk about that. And so acknowledging what went well, not just what went wrong, is part of that value that we're learning to grow in and communicating with one another. And I'm not really sure how we got off track with that, because that's the way I'd love to operate. Please share with me what I've done well. It's a lot easier to swallow the things that went wrong, and I'm much more apt to deal with it. Now, that's part of growing in our family, but this picture also revealed something more about our family. As I asked permission to use this, because if you know Matthias at all, it's kind of like finding treasure. Like, it's very rare that he would come out of the woodwork and talk with people. He's just very shy and likes to be kept in the background. And so every time we show a picture, I got to ask permission for it. And so I asked permission for it, and he said, yeah, it's fine, you can use it. But his concern was that then kids from his school would learn that he's adopted, and they would make fun of him for it. They would ridicule him for it, like, you're adopted, right? Now, that's still prevalent today. And even though we sit here and go, like, you know what, there's a lot of different ways to grow a family, whether it's through adoption, the foster care system, a variety of things. Maybe it's people that are part of your family that are not biologically connected, but they're friends that have been so part of your family, you call them uncle or auntie or whatever, even though they're no relation. Like, there's a variety of ways that we grow this family. There's still this shame. There's still this ridicule that's put on there because it's not the natural or normal way of growing a family. And so as I talked with him about this, I said, okay, well, I don't have to use this, but I'm going to tell you what you're talking about is a great analogy for what the people in 1 Peter were dealing with. The letter to these followers of Jesus that had been living their natural life in a pagan society where they worshiped a bunch of variety of different gods like Zeus, even the emperor, Caesar, they thought as a deity, so they would worship him. So they were moving from that normal way of living into this new way of living of following Jesus as king and bringing about his kingdom. They were being ridiculed for being a part of this new way of living, this different household, if you will, being a part of God's household. And it happened from their neighbors that they lived among. It happened from even people in their own family because they are living a different way than their family had brought them into. So if we put that in our thinking, then we see that from last week, we talked about how these people were saved, and salvation, the way that they understood it, was people being delivered through a new way of living. They're part of a new family, a new way of living, a new way of doing things that brings life to them because of their faith in Jesus, which brings us to where he's going to go today in 1 Peter, which talks about this family of God, this people of God, that we are people, God's growing as God's people through hope, holiness, and love. These are the qualities, these are the things that God grows his family with through Jesus that anyone can join. And when they do join this family, they are going to be growing through hope, holiness, and love. But they're going to be ridiculed for it. They're going to be rejected for it. And so what do we do when we are growing in this family of hope, holiness, and love? Well, the important thing is for us to understand what they're talking about in the way that they're talking about it. So I'm going to invite you to open up to 1 Peter chapter 1. 1 Peter chapter 1. And I would love to work this through with you, like read through it with you, because there's some things to point out that looking at the text in the Bible will be much better than just on the screen. So whether you have a phone or if you want a hard copy of the Bible but you didn't bring one, we have some to share with you. So if you'd like to follow along in this way, just raise your hand nice and high and an usher will find you and bring the Bible to you. And I also have them bookmarked for you, so made it easy as possible. But there's a few things that we need to talk about. The first thing is looking at this set of scripture. I put that on there on purpose. Like, there's a big chunk that we're looking at, and it's very dense. And so I am only going to draw out the things that are connected with this growing as God's family, God's people, through hope, holiness, and love, okay? That's the first thing. The second thing is to understand what they mean by these words, hope, holiness, and love. So let's start with the word hope. I think we kind of have an idea of what hope is, but I think we need to get into their mindset the way that they would use it. The way we use it is kind of this wishful thinking, maybe even cautious optimism. Like, we hope something will happen, but we're kind of surprised if it did. Such as, I hope I win the lottery. I mean, we all hope it. We dream about it, all of that, but we don't actually plan our lives according to whether we win the lottery or not. In fact, we would be really surprised if we won the lottery, wouldn't we? That's the kind of hope that we use, but the kind of hope that they use, the way that they understand it, is that it's an expectation. It's an expectation of good to happen, not just this wishful thinking. Not like surprised if it happened. No, they expect it to happen. It'd be much more like me saying, well, I hope I get paid this week. I expect to, right? I would be surprised if I didn't get paid this week because I get paid every week, right? If you think about it, you organize and you plan your life around being paid because you expect it. That's the type of hope they're talking about. It's an expectation of good to happen. The second thing we need to know about is this word holy or holiness. And again, it's one of those things where we kind of think it has something to do with spiritual things. There's something about God that's holy, but we don't really understand it. And so I want us to understand it well. Holiness has everything to do with something being set apart for a purpose. It's set apart for a purpose. And I just want to give you a little idea about this. So we know this guy named Moses in the Bible. If you don't know him, there's a guy named Moses in the Bible, and he approaches God, and God tells him to remove his sandals because he's walking on holy ground. That ground is set apart for a purpose. The purpose is that it's God's space for God to use, and Moses is entering into it. Much like for these people here, they're now to be holy, the way God is holy, meaning that they are set apart for a purpose, and that purpose is to be this family of God that are growing in hope, holiness, and love to bring about God's kingdom to everyone so other people can join into it, including the people that are rejecting them and ridiculing them. They want to show them what this life really looks like. So with that, let's turn to 1 Peter starting in verse 13, and he's continuing on from what he left off last week, talking about, hey, you are people that are set apart for a purpose, You're a part of this new kingdom. You've been delivered into a new way of living. There's going to be some suffering that comes along with it, but I want you to know these next things about it. So it starts in verse 13, starts with therefore. Therefore, everything I just said, therefore, with minds that are alert and fully sober, set your hope on the grace to be brought to you when Jesus Christ is revealed at his coming. As obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance, but just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do, for it is written, be holy because I am holy. Peter is using their scriptures from the Old Testament to drive home a point that this is the type of family that they are going to be about. There was a way that they used to live, but it was in ignorance. In fact, this idea of not living in the bad way, the evil way that they did before, in ignorance, to live in this new way, he's going to talk about that 3 different times. This is the first of 3. He's going to come back and reference it. But the idea is that they have this expectation that there will be this grace. Grace is gift. So this gift that God will give as they're learning to grow in holiness and love. And they need that. They need this gift of grace so that they can grow in hope and holiness and love. They expect it to happen. They're not surprised if it were to happen. They expect it. They count on God being gracious to them because they need it. It's hard to grow in holiness and be set apart for a purpose. It's hard to grow in this love towards other people. In fact, he's going to continue to double down on that in a second. So if we're to be like this, what more can we understand? Let's look at the next section here, verse 17. It says, since you call on a Father who judges each person's work impartially, live out your time as foreigners here in reverent fear. For you know that it was not with perishable things such as silver or gold that you were redeemed from an empty way of life handed down to you from your ancestors, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. What they're driving home here is this idea of blood is really the life that's represented in the blood that is shed. So it's through Jesus' life who was given to you. Jesus is the most important, is the one you put your faith into. And through that, you are moving away from that way of ignorance, or as he puts it here, the way of life that was handed down to you from your ancestors over and over. That's the normal way of living. You're not living in that way anymore. You're putting your faith in Jesus. You're in this new family. You're living in a new way of hope, holiness, and love. And you know that it was not just with something like silver and gold that is going to waste away, but something that will never, ever waste away. It's imperishable. It's precious, this life of Jesus. And it's all about that life. In fact, he's going to go and talk a little bit about Jesus, which goes back to what we talked about last week, like Jesus being the one who is chosen to give up his life for those to put their faith in him, their trust in him, that now they become part of that chosen family of God, and that keeps growing over and over. So he's going to talk about that next, emphasizing who Jesus is. Verse 20. Jesus was chosen before the creation of the world, but was revealed in these last times for your sake. Through him you believe in God, who raised him from the dead and glorified him, and so your faith and hope are in God. God is the one that's doing the work, choosing Jesus, and choosing that this is the way that his family is going to be grown and brought together through faith in Jesus. And so their expectation is that God would give them this grace, this gift, to allow them to be able to grow in hope and holiness and love. And if that's the case, if they can count on this expectation, the way that God is forming and growing his family in this way, what are they to do? What's that next step for them? It's all about this love piece, and I want to show you what he talks about here in verse 22. Now, that you have purified yourself by obeying the truth, so that you have sincere love for each other. Love one another deeply from the heart, for you have been born again, that new way of living, not of perishable seed, but imperishable, through the living, enduring Word of God, the instructions that God had set out for him. He just used some earlier. But I think it's important for us to understand this word love the way that they would understand the word love. If we're going to grow as God's people through hope, holiness, and love, through this expectation that we have, that we are set apart for a purpose to bring about something from God, it's this love. So what is love? You ever stop and think about it? Like, I think that we have ways that we can kind of describe it, and maybe it's like, well, a feeling, maybe you fall in love, or you maybe fall out of love, and it's just kind of connected to that. But really, the basis of what love is all about who God is. It's the very character, essence of God. And if we look at it in that way, there is a real clear definition of the way that they understand what love is. And love is just simply this: an intentional act of self-giving. Love is an intentional act of self-giving. God is giving of himself intentionally through some kind of action. And what is that action? We've already talked about it several times. Jesus is God's intentional act of self-giving. All of who God is lives in Jesus. It's all of the character. You want to know what God is like as a human being? Jesus is the one. This is who Jesus is. And what does Jesus do? He has this act of self-giving intentionally to lay down his life so that other people can be a part of God's family. And God raises him from the dead, gives him new life, that we can now live in this new life here and now. It has everything about how we grow as God's family through hope, holiness, and love. Intentional acts of self-giving, which I think hits home today as we celebrate Mother's Day, and you think about the sacrifices that are made as mothers give up to care for their children. Fathers do too. Parents, good parents, lay down their lives for their children. Those are intentional acts of self-giving. It's exactly what's happening here. That is what love looks like. And when you live in a world that makes fun of you for your faith, belonging to this new way of living, this new household, it can feel like there's a lot of shame with that. A lot of ridicule and a lot of rejection. And yet, you know that this is the way of living that actually gives life. The former way of living that's handed down to you from your ancestors, that was lived in ignorance, only brought about death. And here, we live in this new way. So, what happens next is that Peter doesn't just go on to talk about this love. He actually takes a little detour because he ends it about God's word, this God's instructions that he gives to these people and how they're going to live in his household, which every household has instructions of what's important to them and how they are formed. Now, he's going to go on a little bit of a tangent in that way and come back. But this is actually really important to see how it's structured. So if you have a physical Bible, it's important to look at this. You're going to see it, some of it's like indented or it's formed different because he's quoting some scriptures and there's some poetic ways here. But what you're going to see is he's going to make some metaphors happen here. Right? The way that these now stones or living stones are growing together, thinking of the temple imagery. And he's going to talk about how there's people that have rejected this cornerstone, this keystone that's laid as the foundation that all the other stones are laid up against. And it has everything to do with if you've rejected that stone, you're going to see that your life is not lined up in the right way that actually brings life. Now, he's got all of that in this next section, and I just want to read through it and have you just draw out some of those things that you're going to be talking about. Notice the word living and what it's attached to. Notice the word precious and what that's attached to, okay? And then he's going to come back together at the end and bring it all together. All right, so let's take a look at verse 24 and following. He says, "For all people are like grass, and all their glory is like the flowers of the field. The grass withers, the flowers fall, but the word of the Lord endures forever. And this is the word that was preached to you. Therefore, rid yourselves of all malice and all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander of every kind. Like newborn babies, crave spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow up in your salvation, delivered in that new way of living, now that you have tasted that the Lord is good." Just like those newborn babies, you're living in a new way. Everything is fresh and brand new. You lived in this other way, but it was filled with hypocrisy and malice and all of those bad things. You're going to live in this new way of living. In other words, you're going to be God's people growing in hope, holiness, and love. But you start out as a little baby and everything is new to you. And this is where he's going to go off onto this tangent here in verse 4. As you come to him, as you come to Jesus, you approach him, the living stone, rejected by humans but chosen by God and precious to him. You also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For in Scripture it says, "See, I lay a stone in Zion, a chosen and precious stone, and the one who trusts in him will never be put to shame. Now to you who believe, this stone is precious, but to those who do not believe, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and a stone that causes people to stumble, and a rock that makes them fall. They stumble because they disobey the message, which is also what they were destined for." Now, destined for, we think about this and going like, oh, so they had no choice but to reject this and stumble over this thing that God is doing by setting this cornerstone, Jesus, in place. No, that's not what it means. It means that this is the natural consequence. If you rejecting who Jesus is, you reject that cornerstone, you're going to end up in this way of living that's only going to bring about death. That's that former way of life. And not seeing that Jesus is this precious stone that we're to align our lives with, that brings about hope, holiness, and love. And then he brings it all back together again. He went on a tangent, now he's back together, talking about who we are in God's family. These people that are growing in hope, holiness, and love, what does he say about us? And here's what he says in the following verses of verse 9. "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of the darkness into his wonderful life. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." He comes back to what this family looks like. This household of God, this spiritual family that's growing up together in hope, holiness, and love, that they are to be unique and set apart for this purpose of bringing about God's kingdom and showing who God is to the people around them, that this really is the way of living that brings about life, because their former way of living only brought about death. And this is the peace for us to sit in, to sit with, knowing that if you put your trust in Jesus and that you are delivered into this new way of living, that you're part of this household of God, this is the people of God, and you're growing up in hope, holiness, and love. And I can't imagine that people that are ridiculing that and rejecting that way, what do they have grounds to reject and ridicule? It's about hope. It's about this expectation of good that comes from God. It's about holiness and being set apart for God's purpose of bringing his kingdom of love into this world, and that you love one another. This is where our new life is all about. This is where our new life begins. And it's such an important point that whatever you may have gotten out of this message, what I want to drive home is this new life that we begin to live, no matter what ridicule or rejection it brings, whatever shame is put upon you, that you can continue to grow in hope, holiness, and love as God's family. And we're going to sit in that for a little bit. In fact, our closing song has a great way of stating this. Here's some of the verses as the band comes back out. So the song is called Death Was Arrested. But look at these words. Your grace, that gift from God, your grace so free washes over me. You have made me new. Now my life begins with you, with Jesus. That's where our life begins. And notice how it switches from the individual you to the plural us. It's your endless love, that intentional act of self-giving. It's your endless love pouring down on us. You have made us new. Now life begins with you. That's for everyone that wants to enter into this life. So I'm going to invite you to just sit in this song, saying these songs as we're praising that God has brought us from a place of darkness into his wonderful light, meaning this way of living before, now living in this new way. So would you please stand with us as we sing this last song?